Hello people, and welcome to an informative series where we investigate the world of old video games, analyzing myths, concepts, phenomena, and secrets. Things are not always what they seem. The first appearance deceives many, and to know more, we must explore beyond the limits of conventional thinking. Mega Man. A platformer the general public knows well. It's up there with the likes of Mario, Metroid and Zelda, and even though it never reached the sales of its rivals, it managed to gather a hefty fan base around the world, and plenty of others who spent a massive chunk of their childhood sitting on the living room floor trying to find a weakness for Woodman. But there's one thing we've yet to confirm. Are Mega Man games based on trial and error gameplay, or could there be a bigger picture that most people missed when attempting to guide the Blue Bomber through various environments? The following comments are real, taken from various sources around the internet. Mega Man games are memorization games. They're not so much games as they are challenges. Mega Man games are all about trial and error. All of the challenges are cheap and unfair. You can't see most deaths coming before it's too late. It's not that I'm bad at video games. I'm pretty damn good at most video games. I just have a disdain to the Mega Man franchise because it's a game where you have to learn where you die, by dying. The only way to get any enjoyment out of Mega Man is to first play through them multiple times and learn where the death traps are. Only then can you start utilizing strategies once you know how to avoid certain deaths. First, we need to educate ourselves on what the definition of trial and error is. Trial and error is a problem-solving method in which multiple attempts are made to reach a solution. It is a basic method of learning that essentially all organisms use to learn new behaviors. Trial and error is trying a method, observing if it works, and if it doesn't, trying a new method. This process is repeated until success or a solution is reached. Trial and error is a way of achieving an aim or solving a problem by trying a number of different methods and learning from the mistakes that you make. There are a couple of aspects that we need to understand before we can answer the question proposed in this episode. Here's the infamous section with Quickman stage and its quick beams. Upon reaching the area and dropping through the transition to face the beams, you will most likely die the first time because you had no idea that was going to happen. Here's a scene where Mega Man tries to make a jump in Dustman stage, but gets caught by an up and down that emerges from the pit, killing him. Once more, getting snagged by a Bunbee catcher in Galaxy Man stage that leads to a quick kill if you don't know what's coming before it's too late. Likewise, landing straight on an enemy when the screen transitions. Here and here. Trading paint with fish jumping out of water and disappearing blocks that were made in a way where the player had no way of knowing when they would stack on top of each other, resulting in a sure death. It can be observed that in this case the term trial and error seems to be a misnomer. It should be understood that trial and error is part of every video game, because without it, it wouldn't be a game in the first place. If trial and error isn't the term that should be used, then what is? If the up and down enemies were considered having trial and error gameplay, then the whole challenge would be different. Trial and error implies that you had a choice, and you chose one method over the other. Let's investigate this scene further. In certain types of video games, it's typical to have pits as one of the hazards. Games have taught us that dropping into the black void of nothingness is bad and should be avoided. When the game then uses these elements in its level design, the player must make the assumption that jumping over the detrimental thing is what you should be doing, unless taught otherwise. Watch closely as Mega Man runs and tries to make the jump. He gets caught by the enemy and drops down. If it indeed was trial and error, this would have not happened. We would have either jumped over the pit from a running stance, stopped before the pit to examine the possible dangerous situation, jump a little bit forward but reversed back to test the safety of the element, or even stopped to use weapons such as shields to bypass the pit with extreme measures. All of these methods would imply that indeed it is trial and error. Our problem is not knowing we had a choice. By traversing stages, jumping over hundreds of pits and not having a problem, the player can suddenly start to question the mechanic instead of just jumping over the pits as usual, unless the level specifically gives you the teaching element about upcoming pits that can be different from the rest. In this case, we can't say this is trial and error, since we didn't have a choice to begin with. The outcome of this situation is influenced by decisions that were uninformed at the time and cannot be undone. We had no idea this pit was different from the rest, and doing what is asked of us, which is jumping over the gap, ends up with Mega Man getting killed because of a surprise element. If this was trial and error, we wouldn't necessarily have died the first time, since we would have the information that something was different, and we should first observe it. When we look closer to the quick beams in Quickman stage, it should be noted that clearing the first couple of screens of the beams on your first try is like winning the lottery. It's extremely rare to pull this off. It can be a combination of good luck and reflexes, but it's safe to assume that nearly everyone will die here on the first go. But why does this happen? If trial and error, like people presume, we take what we learned from the up and down incident prior. Once we land to the screen with the quick beams, the beams start rushing from both sides without any telegraphs or visual aids or even sound effects. We are talking about sound telegraphs, not sounds that happen at the same time, but sounds that should happen prior. It is only after we've died that we realize how this works. The beams will come no matter what, unless you use the time stopper. Before knowing how this section works, death is almost certain. For this to be considered trial and error, we should be able to try different things before we die. This is however not the case. Upon landing here, there is so little time you will just die before knowing what happened. Only after dying to the section once does it become trial and error, but only after dying first. Now we possess the power of knowing that we have choices and different methods we can try to bypass the section. The bun bee catchers are borderline. While you do have choices and different methods you can try while being carried, making it trial and error, the first time it ever happens, you'll most likely get snagged before you knew you had options. You now possess the information, however, that they might drop down from anywhere in the entire level, and traversing the terrain should be done carefully. Trial and error comes in when you decide whether to run full speed or take your time. The Boo Beam trap in Mega Man 2 can be considered trial and error, as it doesn't outright kill you and you have several options to try. This is one of the worst situations, however, as it's overly difficult, and if you do die, your weapon energy most likely isn't enough to kill the boss, so you need to either game over to get the weapon energy back, or keep killing enemies hoping for item drops. The artificial difficulty comes after you've already died, as they could have easily dropped some weapon energy pickups before the gate, but decided not to. Getting to understand the term is vital, and understandably, people use trial and error because it's easy to say, and everyone understands what you mean. But at the end of the day, the moments that get blamed the most are not trial and error. Let's look at how this works before we can make the conclusion and figure out what we're actually dealing with. Are the platforms on Gutsman trial and error? No. The first platform has no holes where the platform would give way, so you can stand on it for as long as you need, inspecting the platforms below. You can then take mental notes and realize that the platforms give way when the small notch underneath it goes over the gaps. You can then take whatever measures you need to bypass the section with the knowledge you gathered. The first platform is called a teaching element. It familiarizes the challenge with the player and gives them an idea on how it works. The player is then tested in a more dangerous setting to see what they learned. If trial and error, the player would need to blindly choose one option over the other and see if it kills them or not. There is no such aspect on this section. Is the weakness order of robot masters trial and error? Yes, as you realistically can't have the knowledge beforehand about each Robot Master's weakness, only by trial and error do you find the real weapon if clues aren't handed out, but that's the whole point of the game. Digging deeper into this issue, we must realize the following. In any action platformer game, most players lack patience. When you give the player a character to control that can jump and shoot, or even slide, you give them a reason to go fast and get it done. Games have always been looked at as something to do on your pastime, sometimes with little to no brain power needed, so it's understandable why it seems like a good option to rush through, rather than to stop and think on your sequence of upcoming actions. It is merely seen as enemies coming at you, which you then need to dispose of. Same goes for the different types of challenges. For the untrained or hasty mind, it's simply easier to go fast and learn by dying than to actually sit down and think of your next move. If you are this kind of player, then the challenges presented to you can be seen as what you would call trial and error. But it is because you created the problem, not the game. To play the game to the most optimal level, you need to understand what the game is trying to tell you. If you're being introduced to new challenges, mechanics, and enemy types in a rather safe environment, or even a bit more precarious setting, it is up to you how you want to deal with it, but your actions don't change what the game is about. If you deny information that is critical to progress unharmed, there is nobody to blame but you. Mega Man as a game has always been about teaching the player first, then testing them to see if they took it to heart or not. First, there is a mechanic or a challenge. You get to play with it until you're comfortable enough to trust your newly acquired skills and dare to proceed. If the teaching elements are ignored, the player can perceive the games as mostly trial and error, because they didn't realize what they were supposed to see and experience before coming in contact with the real challenge. Before we move on, it is important to know the real term. As explained, trial and error is a problem-solving method in which multiple attempts are made to reach a solution. So, most of what people consider trial and error moments aren't really trial and error. It's called artificial difficulty. It is fake difficulty, and it is what happens when an incorrect action kills the player, ends the mission in failure, or otherwise forces the player, for example, to replay a section from the beginning, or simply just causes harm to them for no good reason. Artificial difficulty doesn't necessarily kill the player outright, but it's simply there to make the game harder by unfair means. Dying to quick beams on the first try, getting knocked down by an up and down or a fish, and having disappearing blocks stacked on top of each other unexpectedly are all based on artificial difficulty. They are surprise moments, but most of the time done in a way where the player had no idea what was coming before it was too late. Artificial difficulty can also be present in other ways, such as jumps that are overly difficult to make without any good reason behind it. Teaching the player about artificial difficulty can't be done in a proper manner, as the whole reason behind it is to either kill the player or create areas that are difficult just to be difficult, maybe in the hopes of elongating the clear time of the game. Artificial difficulty will disregard your efforts, it doesn't care about teaching you, and the only thing it wants is to cause harm to you, one way or another. Artificial difficulty deviates from the rules of the game you play by, and as a result, your skill at the section means nothing. Overcoming artificial difficulty by repetition means that you've memorized it, thus allowing you to use the skill that was previously not possible. At this point, artificial difficulty is still there, but through overcoming it, the player gains memorization of the hazards and can bypass them more easily. This doesn't remove artificial difficulty as a factor, it just means the player can now overcome it. Trial and error has nothing to do with artificial difficulty. Mega Man gets blamed often about its trial and error gameplay, when that is how video games work in the first place. The term trial and error in itself isn't wrong, and it's evident in Mega Man. You test different weapons on different enemies, you overcome obstacles through problem solving with assorted methods. It's all trial and error and the natural, usual way of proceeding in a game. But the real issue is what people are talking about is artificial difficulty, not trial and error. Transitioning to spikes, idiotic jumps, enemies coming from behind you, pit hoppers, they are all artificial difficulty, as you have no choice but to get harmed unless you get incredibly lucky. All of these can be avoided the first time, but it doesn't negate the term. Otherwise the term wouldn't even exist if luck played a factor when considering it. The best example of artificial difficulty, aside from Mega Man, is rubber banding on racing games. Some games do what is called a rubber band AI, where if you're behind, the AI will slow down, making it much easier for you, but if you overtake them, they will speed up and most of the time go faster than you ever could. They are modifying the difficulty on the go based on your performance, and that to me doesn't make any sense. This is artificial difficulty. So, where are we at? Getting hit by an up and down is artificial difficulty because you had no idea it was going to happen. But after you've died, it becomes trial and error as you now know you have options and choices to tackle the challenge. You can trigger the enemy and jump back, you can shoot it, or make a careful jump over. It should be noted that almost anything in any game is trial and error, as it's mostly testing and seeing what works and where. The term trial and error should be used in cases such as trying different weapons on different robot masters and seeing which ones work and which do not. Shooting a shielded met versus it being open. Jumping on an enemy to see if it damages the protagonist or not. These are all trial and error based incidents. Like stated prior, Mega Man teaches the player first and then tests them on a more dangerous setting. This wasn't as evident in the original Mega Man or Mega Man 2, but the later installments tried to always make sure the player knew what was coming. Even if the first two games were a bit more unfair, by no means does that mean the entire franchise is unfair. They did a good job at gradually ranking up the difficulty, but there are some artificial moments present, definitely. Most people have only ever played Mega Man 2, and it is true that the first two games were more trigger happy than the rest. If you only had experience with one of the Mega Man games, or even just a few of the stages, it doesn't make sense to call the entire franchise artificially difficult just because you're lacking the information or willingness to see how they're built. The examples we've investigated in this video are extremely rare occurrences and only happen a handful of times in the entire classic lineup. Mega Man is always about teaching and testing. Teaching and testing. Teaching and testing. When artificial difficulty does raise its head, it hurts, but by no means does it mean the entire franchise is built on that ideology. For every 50 teaching elements, there is maybe one instance of artificial difficulty or artificial kills, also known as learning by dying. That is hardly enough to conclude that Mega Man is based on artificial moments when you just ignore the foundation the games were built upon. Most of the time, the player is directly responsible for their actions. Lacking patience, being hasty, rushing through the games is a sure way to ignore the signs of upcoming dangers. 98% of the time spent in Mega Man games is entirely in the hands of the player, but the 2% does catch us off guard. The more you get frustrated, the more you run through obstacles and enemies, the more you ignore teaching elements, the lower the percentage of being in control goes, and the more you blame the game for being unfair. The footholders are glitched in a way where if you jump on them while they are moving up, there's a chance you'll drop through. This is not artificial difficulty, it is just a bug in the game. Platform. Scissors. Both at the same time. Not artificial difficulty, but reflex testing. Disappearing blocks. Not artificial difficulty, as you can see the entire pattern before you attempt it. Crystal choppers. You can observe the entire pattern of each tube before attempting. Not artificial difficulty. Dropping enemies on the player is artificial difficulty, and after learning that it takes place, it then becomes trial and error as you try to solve how to go past it unharmed, and then finally it becomes memorization, so you can use your acquired skills to bypass it next time. It is important to note that just because a gameplay feature is frustrating does not mean it's artificially difficult. We could list every challenge and obstacle from every Mega Man game, and that's possible only because the games were built upon these teaching elements that turn into challenges. If the games were mostly about artificial difficulty, I'd be able to showcase several hours of footage to you where the gameplay was unfair, but that is simply not the case. I was having a hard time already trying to find enough examples during this investigation that I could include as examples of artificially tedious sections. If you're having trouble with Mega Man, be humble and practice until you remedy your mistakes. It's the only way you can acquire skill. Most of the mistakes we make in these games are the result of lacking patience, not artificial difficulty. If a pit hopper kills you once, you can't deem the entire franchise being cheap. Games would be pretty boring in nature if they never surprised the player or threw any curveballs. Just like in life, there are unexpected moments and it is up to you how to deal with them. Since Mega Man, we've gotten a lot of games that the general public calls Mega Man Hard or Nintendo Hard, and they're all about cheap deaths and artificial difficulty and almost nothing else. You couldn't be further away from the truth when saying something artificially difficult is just like Mega Man. I think it's time to look in the mirror and respect Mega Man for what it really is. You've been watching RSI. Good night. Thanks for watching another Nico Evaluates. Join us in Discord to talk about Mega Man, White Bread and the neighbor's dog. Impact the show in my Patreon or just throw a few bucks if you wanna buy me coffee. Check our merch at teespring.com/store/Snapster and get my quotes on your shirt. If you want to see weekly Mega Man races, go ahead and subscribe to Snapster. Catch you on the next one.